Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Hopefully everyone can hear me. Right, so today I shall be reading on the New Testament. Found this book, The Text of the New Testament. Bruce Metzger, Transmission, Corruption, and Restoration. The motivation for reading this particular text is actually looking at what's happening with respect to the rise of Christianity to a degree. It's, I won't say significant, but certainly a noticeable one. And it's noticeable because if you look at, for example, TikTok, and you look at other mediums, social mediums, you see that the youth are trending towards Christianity now. I believe there's three reasons why this is captivating. Number one is simply because we are in a time where truth matters the most. We know, for example, what's been happening with certain legal cases regarding certain, how can I put this, mathematicians, right? The Jeffrey Epsteins. We know that D. is also more or less a free man. And we also know how certain people have a stronghold over institutions. So I've been observing not only TikTok, but YouTube, Instagram, and where I used to study, where I do my research, and where I work. So I think it's important that as a Muslim we have to understand and grasp what's important. And as a Muslim, what's important is the truth ultimately. And sadly, I will include myself, we don't grasp the entirety of this right here. And so that's why all of us are split into many factions. Yes, we know Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam said that there will be 72 sects in my ummah, and only one group will go in Jannah. Not one sect, but one group. People often misquote and choose to ignore that fact. So I'm going to begin with page number 1 here, and hopefully grasp the argument that Bruce is trying to put forward. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. The Making of Ancient Books, chapter number 1. I'll show it here. This is a second-hand book I got from America, so it's been highlighted before. It's a really hard book to find, mind you. Anyway, until the invention of printing with movable type in the 15th century, the text of the New Testament, and indeed the text of every ancient record, could be transmitted only by laboriously copying it letter by letter and word by word. The consideration, therefore, of the process involved in the making and transcribing of manuscripts is of the utmost importance of the historian of ancient culture in general and to the student of the New Testament in particular. So, those who aren't familiar entirely, the Quran is an oral tradition, it's not a written tradition. Yes, it was written down, of course, because people had to keep a record. They had to keep a record, even if it was sparse, on vellum and other parchments and pieces of leaf, as well as stone, the bone of camels, so on and so forth. The New Testament, however, wasn't as easy in terms of preservation, because Allah as he states in the Quran, has promised only to preserve one of the text, and that one, of course, is the Quran. The following sections deal with those aspects of Greek paleography that bear upon the textual criticism of the New Testament. So, essentially, this book is dealing with the manuscripts and the issues regarding the manuscripts, because that's really and truly what Muslims, Christians, and Jews as well, that's what they argue with each other, is the preservation of the script. Muslims say we have the most preserved, which is true. The Jews claim to say the same, and so do the Christians. But what does the evidence say, right? Well, we'll see from a Christian point of view. Clay tablets, stone, bone, wood, leather, various metals, potsherds, papyrus, and parchment, vellum were all used in antiquity to receive writing. Among these several materials, the student of the New Testament is interested chiefly in the last two, for almost all New Testament manuscripts are made of either papyrus or parchment. So the New Testament is recorded either on paper or on parchment. So, for example, one of the Gospels, the record is as big as a credit card, as a debit card, probably about this big. I think it's called P67. You can look it up. It's about this big. That's all the record, right? Whereas the Mus'haf, as it's called in Arabic, which is the manuscript of the Quran, we have one which is dated back to the life of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and it's formally agreed upon that during the Khilafah of Uthman alayhi salam, that particular Mus'haf was used, and it was preserved for a very long time. Of course, still, because we have it to this day, so it is preserved, but it was kept for a very long time at the University of Birmingham, and I believe it's Surah Taha that's been preserved. What's interesting about Surah Taha is one of those surahs that influenced many people on the journey of Islam, and one of those individuals is actually Umar al-Khattab, and that's significant because it was his sister who had those manuscripts, and his sister decided to keep those manuscripts for herself, and Umar slapped his sister in the face, saying, "How dare you become Muslim?" In any case, he read Surah Taha. After reading Surah Taha, he became Muslim, and not just a Muslim, one of the greatest Muslims to walk planet Earth, and his example is still used to this day. And it's only Islam that can elevate someone who comes from a pagan background, because Umar came from a pagan background, much like Khalid ibn Walid, much like Amr ibn As. These were, you can't say, one of the top members of society in Arabia at the time. So it's an interesting fact there. The manufacture of papyrus was a flourishing business in Egypt, for the papyrus plant grew plentifully in the shallow waters of the Nile at the delta. Reference Book of Job 8:11. Can papyrus grow where there is no marsh? Interesting. About 12 or 15 feet in height, the stem of the plant, which is triangular in cross section and as thick as a man's wrist, was cut into sections about a foot long. Each section was split open lengthwise and the pith cut into thin strips. A layer of these was placed on a flat surface, all the fibers running in the same direction, and on top another layer was laid, with the fibers running at right angles to the lower layer. The two layers were then pressed together until they formed one fabric, a fabric which, though not so brittle that it can sometimes be crumbled into powder, once had a strength nearly equal to that of good paper. So really it was just layers of plant that would be pressed together, and after pressing them together it would form a sheet of paper essentially. The manufacture of parchment for writing purposes has an interesting history. According to Pliny the Elder in his Natural History, chapter 8:21, it was King Eumenes of Pergamum, a city of Mysia of Asia Minor, who promoted the preparation and use of parchment. This ruler, probably Eumenes II, who ruled from 197 BC to 159 BC, planned to found a library in his city which would rival the famous Library of Alexandria in Egypt. This ambition did not please Ptolemy of Egypt, probably Ptolemy Epiphanes, 205 to 182 BC, who thereupon put an embargo on the export of papyrus sections. So, interestingly, to get rid of the competition, possibly Ptolemy Epiphanes, decided to put an embargo. Embargo means to put a ban on this particular papyrus, this plant. It was this embargo which forced Eumenes to develop the production of vellum, which from the place of its origin received the Greek name, I don't know how to say that, whence our English word parchment is derived. Whatever may be thought of the details of this story, actually leather parchment was used for books long before Eumenes. The gist of it is probably true, namely that a high quality of parchment was developed at Pergamum, and that the city became famous in the manufacture and export of this kind of writing material, eventually giving its name to the product. Fascinating. Parchment or vellum, the two words are often used interchangeably, but exact writers restrict the word vellum to describe a finer, superior quality of parchment. It was made from the skins of cattle, sheep, goats, and antelopes, and especially from the young of these animals. So the young skin was very important. Now, what's interesting about animals who are young and their skin, it's their flesh and their tissue are fresh, so to speak. That's why the idea that adrenochrome, which is an element found in the human blood, is quite common, and maybe it's similar to this case, I don't know. After the hair had been removed by scraping, the skins were washed smooth with pumice and dressed with chalk. Deluxe editions, according to Saint Jerome, who did not approve of such extravagance, were made of vellum dyed in deep purple and written with gold and silver inks. So now silver and gold ink was used to write these particular parchments. That's really interesting, because if you look at old Ottoman manuscripts, by old I mean the earlier Ottoman manuscripts, you can see gold ink being used. If you look at the Persian manuscripts of the Quran, there's a lot of gold being used, and beautiful decorations at the start of every surah. And if you look at the manuscripts from the Mughal era, present day India, you can also see some interesting mix of different inks. So the reason for this, of course, is because once they got hold of vellum and papyrus, they did their best to make the most of it. Imagine there's something that is really scarce, right? And you do your best to withhold and not let go of it. Maybe this is why a lot of much of the older generation from South Asia, Latin America, the African continent, they never really throw things. They keep hold to it. Cardboard boxes, bags, containers, so on and so forth. So I'm not tying the two together, but I see a social psychological correlation here in terms of the culture. Right. Ordinary editions were written with black or brown ink and had decorative headings and initial letters colored with blue or yellow or most often red ink. Whence the word rubric from a rubber, the Latin word for red, ruber. Okay. Interesting. So rubric comes from the Latin word ruber, which means red in color. Maybe that's why ruby, the stone, red stone. I'm not sure why I'm doing this. I think I need to fix my cherry a bit. So that is quite interesting to learn about, manuscripts, because this book is focusing on manuscripts of the New Testament. Now, vellum or parchment continued to be generally used until the late Middle Ages. At that time, paper, which was made of cotton, hemp, or flax, having been introduced into Europe from China by Arabian traders, became popular and supplanted other writing materials. Oh, so it was the Arabs, Muslim and of course non-Muslim, because there were many Jewish Arab people, obviously Nasara, Christian Arab people, and Sabiyun, as the Quran speaks of them as people of the book, similar to Zoroastrians, and they seem to introduce this idea of writing, right? So I personally don't like going back to constantly speaking about what the Muslims did in the past in terms of scientific discovery and the origination of civilization to a degree. Sorry, should I say the restoration of civilization? But this is something that I didn't even know. I'm just learning this today. Now the Arabs introduced this. And here the reference for this, for those who are interested in evidence like myself, the author says, see below page 261. So if I go to 261, it should give me a reference here somewhere. 261. Here we go. So this is a French book, Introduction de la étude des manuscrits grecs. I never took French. French is horrible. I'm more well acquainted with Spanish and Italian, but French, I don't really like the people, the civilization, and the language is one of the worst languages ever. Personal opinion, it's not a blanket statement over the French people, but I mean, ever since they disrespected Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam many years ago, much like the Danish people, I generally don't like them. A quick side note here: famous philosopher and playwright by the name of Voltaire, he wrote a play called Muhammad, and he made fun of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Many people quote Voltaire. One of his famous quotes is, there's actually two famous quotes that are usually attributed to him. One is, "I will fight to the death for your right to say something I disagree with." Second is, "Man is born free but everywhere in shackles." So it's an interesting perspective, but all of that is redundant once you mock Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So interesting reference here, Robert Dervisi. I'm not sure who this individual is, but I guess we shall underline it, inshallah, and at some point check it out. Right, so the forms of ancient books. So right now we've discussed the materials used. Now once you have the material, how do you form it? Do you make it into a booklet? Do you make it into scrolls? Do you actually make it into a book? So how do you go about this, right? Let me just change the angle here for a second. Right, so in the Greco-Roman world, literary works were customarily published in the format of a scroll made of papyrus or parchment. The papyrus roll or scroll was made of gluing together side by side separate sheets of papyrus and then winding the long strip around the stick, thus producing a volume, a word derived from the Latin word volumen, something rolled up. Okay, interesting. I like the etymology. Etymology means the origin of words, and it's giving me Latin words. In fact, I was learning Latin at one point in my youth. Let me quickly bring the dictionary here. Got one of these many years ago, so we could give it a try. Volumen. Okay. Here we go. Volume. Book. Liber. Mass. Mules. Of sound. Magnitudo. Okay. So yeah, volume also is linked to, sound. Volume is book. Volume is also mass. So how much of it is spread out is essentially volume. So the volume of this book is small, but if this was to weigh 100 kilos, it could weigh. So that's mass. So mass is the actual, what we mistakenly call weight is actually not kilo or grams, that's actually newtons. So mass is the actual measurement of how heavy a object is. Volume is how much it's spread. Density is to a degree how thick it is. So the length of such a papyrus roll was limited by considerations of convenience in handling the roll. The normal Greek literary roll seldom exceeded 30 feet in length. Interesting. So the Greeks always kept books, volumes in this context, up to 35 feet. And the reference here is from Callimachus, the learned cataloguer of books in the Great Library of Alexandria, was accustomed to say, "A big book is a big nuisance." Ceremonial copies of the Egyptian Book of the Dead have been found, which measure more than 100 feet in length, but these were not meant to be read, but to be buried in the tomb of a rich owner. Fascinating, okay. Ancient authors therefore would divide a long literary work into several books each of which could be accommodated in one roll. The two longest books in the New Testament, the Gospel of Luke and the Book of Acts, which would each have filled an ordinary papyrus roll of 31 or 32 feet in length. Doubtless this is one of the reasons why Luke Acts was issued in 2 volumes instead of 1. So the 2 longest books in the New Testament, the Gospel of Luke and the Book of Acts. I think the Book of Acts, I've come across something regarding something to do with blasphemy. Don't quote me on this, but I don't remember. And Gospel of Luke, I'm not sure about Gospel of Luke much, so it's an interesting aspect we can look into further. Thank you for the likes on YouTube. Jazakallah khair. If you have any questions, post them. I'm just learning this myself. Right, so the 2 longest books are Gospel of Luke and the Book of Acts. Each would have filled an ordinary papyrus roll of 31 or 32 feet in length. Doubtless this is one of the reasons why Luke Acts was issued in 2 volumes instead of 1. Okay. On the roll thus formed, the writing was arranged in a series of columns, each about 2 or 3 inches wide. So you had 31 to 32 feet length, 2 to 3 inches width. Okay. The height of the columns, which ran parallel to the stick on which the roll was wound, varied, of course, with the height of the original papyrus sheets. Sometimes, but not very often, the roll was written on both sides. This was called an opistholograph. Clearly I've never come across this word before. Opistholograph. Okay, so this is where on each side of the scroll something's written down. Interesting. The roll was relatively inconvenient to use. The reader had to employ both hands, unrolling the scroll with one hand and rolling it up with the other as the reading proceeded. Moreover, the Christian community soon discovered how laborious it was to try to find specific passages in their sacred books when they were written in roll form. So it seems they had to constantly roll, unroll, roll and unroll, and at times read both sides. I can see how inconvenient it could be. Early in the 2nd century, or perhaps even at the close of the 1st century, the codex, or leaf form of book, began to come into extensive use in the church. A codex was made of folding one or more sheets of papyrus in the middle and sewing them together. Christians found that this form had a number of advantages over the roll. So they would stitch papers together rather than have it written on both sides. It permitted all 4 Gospels or all of the epistles of Paul to be bound into one book or format, which was impossible so long as the roll was used. B, it facilitated the consultation of proof texts. And C, it was better adapted to receiving writing on both sides of the page, thus keeping the cost of production down. The suggestion may well be true that it was Gentile Christians who early adopted the codex form for the scriptures instead of the roll form as part of a deliberate attempt to differentiate the usage of the church from that of the synagogue, which was accustomed to transmit the Old Testament on scrolls. If you've seen the Torah, it's a large paper that's been rolled up, and when they're reading it, the wooden spindle, I guess I would say, is constantly open and rolled. So it's interesting to know. The advantages of parchment over papyrus for the making of books seem obvious to us today. It was a much tougher and more lasting material than that of the fragile papyrus. Moreover, parchment leaves could receive writing without difficulty on both sides, whereas the vertical direction of the fibers on the reverse side of a sheet of papyrus made that side somewhat less satisfactory than the other as a writing surface. On the other hand, parchment also had its defects. For example, the edges of parchment leaves are apt to become puckered and uneven. Furthermore, according to the observation of Galen, the famous Greek physician of the 2nd century, parchment which is shiny strains the eyes more than the papyrus, which does not reflect so much light. Eusebius, the noted Christian scholar of Caesarea and Palestine, included in his Life of Constantine information concerning an imperial request for 50 parchment manuscripts. About 331 AD, when Constantine wished to secure copies of the scriptures for the new churches which he proposed to build in Constantinople, he wrote to Eusebius requesting him to arrange, without delay, for the production of 50 copies of sacred scriptures to be written on fine parchment in a legible manner and in a convenient portable form by professional scribes, thoroughly accomplished in their art. These orders, Eusebius continues, were followed by the immediate execution of the work itself, which we sent him in magnificent and elaborately bound volumes of threefold and fourfold forms. The reference here is the Greek text of the concluding clause is difficult to interpret, and the words have been taken in widely different senses. Thus, it has been suggested that the words refer to codices which were composed of queries of 3 or 4 double leaves, they were polyglot Bibles in 3 or 4 languages, that they were harmonies of 3 or 4 Gospels, that copies were sent off to Constantine 3 or 4 at a time, that each Bible was in 3 or 4 parts, or that the pages had 3 or 4 columns of script. Each of these interpretations involves more or less serious difficulties. Perhaps the least satisfactory interpretation is the one mentioned last. For discussions of the problems involved, see the Sinaitic and Vatican manuscripts and the copy sent by Eusebius to Constantinople. Okay, interesting. And the use of dictation in ancient book production. So essentially, it was extremely difficult to even get exact copies done correctly. It was extremely troublesome, to say the least. Interesting. Let's grab a pencil. Classic. The suggestion has been made by several scholars that the two oldest parchment manuscripts of the Bible, which are in existence today, namely Codex Vaticanus and Codex Sinaiticus, see chapter 2 for description of these manuscripts, may have been among those ordered by Constantine. So Constantine essentially ordered Codex Vaticanus and Codex Sinaiticus. I've heard of Codex Sinaiticus, and okay, interesting. It has been pointed out that Eusebius's curious expression, volumes of threefold and fourfold forms, agrees with the circumstance that these two codices have respectively 3 volumes and 4 volumes on each page. Okay, interesting. There are, however, 1 or 2 indications which point to Egypt as a place of origin for the Codex Vaticanus, and the type of text found in both codices is unlike that of Eusebius's. The most that can be said with certainty, therefore, is that the codices Venaticus and Sinaiticus are doubtless like those which Constantine ordered Eusebius to have copied. Wow, so there's even doubts regarding the actual script that Constantine ordered to be essentially made. It's quite fascinating to learn. Interesting, okay. Ancient scribes and their handiwork. So we discussed materials and the origin, forms, and now the scribes and their handiwork. Okay. In writing on papyrus, the scribe was accustomed to utilize the horizontal fibers of the recto side of the sheet as guidelines for his script. Before writing on parchment, he would score the surface with a blunt pointed instrument, drawing not only horizontal lines but 2 or more vertical lines as well, thus marking the margins of each column of writing. In many manuscripts, these guidelines are still visible, as are also the pinpricks which the scribe made first in order to guide him in ruling the vellum. Okay, interesting. There is even a science to pinpricks. Prickings in a manuscript of Orleans. Interesting. Different schools of scribes employed various procedures of ruling, and occasionally it is often possible for the modern manuscript by comparing its ruling pattern, as it is called, with those in manuscripts whose place of origin is known. Since the hair side of vellum is darker than the flesh side, it was found that the most pleasing effect upon the reader was obtained when the separate sheets were not indiscriminately gathered together in queries, but when the hair side of one page faced the hair side of the opposite page, and the flesh side faced the flesh side, wherever the book was opened. So there was the dark side here, for example, the dark side here, and then when you flip the page, you have the flesh side here and the flesh side here. So all of this was a process that needed to be done, and then there was scalings and then prickings, which was a pin used to guide them when it comes to ruling. So far we can tell that a lot of effort, much effort has gone into ensuring that alhamdulillah, that these things are done properly. Wow, it's quite fascinating actually. So just checking one of the I'm gonna wrap up in a few minutes, and right. Right. In antiquity, two styles of Greek handwriting were in general use. The cursive or running hand, which would be written rapidly, was employed for non literary everyday documents such as letters, accounts, receipts, petitions, deeds, and the like. Contractions and abbreviations of frequently occurring words, such as the definite article and certain prepositions, were common. Literary works, on the other hand, were written in a more formal style of handwriting called unicles. Okay, interesting. This book hand was characterized by more deliberate and carefully executed letters, each one separate from the others, somewhat like our capital letters. Some of the most beautiful specimens of Greek handwriting are certain classical and biblical manuscripts dating from the 3rd to 6th century. In the course of time, however, the style of bookhand began to deteriorate and unicles became thick and clumsy. Then, about the beginning of the 9th century, a reform in handwriting was initiated, and a script of smaller letters in a running hand called minuscules was created for the production of books. So the word minuscule also means small in size. Interesting. The word minuscule is derived from the Latin word minusculus, meaning rather small. It was used because the letters designated by this term are usually smaller than capitals and unicles. Very, 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 very interesting. Quite fascinating. Well, many people often forget that the Greeks pioneered many aspects, but excuse me, many aspects of science, grammar, literature, language, art. They're quite disgusting people as well, but a large portion of Greek knowledge has been lost, and the fact that they had a particular style of writing and they had an entire science when it comes to writing is very fascinating. So it just goes to show that writing, recording, and the idea of keeping a record has always been a part of the human experience. Many of us tend to forget that before screens, before anything as such, writing was a big aspect of the human experience. And unfortunately, many people are going away from that. One thing, one of the things I like to do in order to ensure my writing is up to date. By up to date, I mean good, is I use a fountain pen when I write. I use a fountain pen or I use a Uniball pen, and before that I used to practice with a pencil, because these are very free flowing, pencil and ink, fountain pen. Problem with ballpoint pens is that it has a round surface, so in a sense when you're writing it's very difficult to keep, which might sound counterintuitive, but when you're writing with a ballpoint pen it doesn't let you slip. When you're writing with a pencil or a fountain pen, to a degree it allows you to slip, and when you slip when writing it allows you to make that error and then you come back. So with a ballpoint pen you can't really write in joined writing. Pencil and fountain you can very easily. So for those who are looking to improve their handwriting, start with pencil. Even when I write Arabic or Urdu, I use a pencil or a fountain pen. That's why I always keep a pen on me. I despise ballpoint pens. They can ruin your handwriting in a very short amount of time. So anyway, this modified form of the cursive script became popular almost at once throughout the Greek world, though some liturgical books continued for 1 or 2 centuries to be written in uncial script. Is it Yun Seol or Yun Kyo? I think it's Yun Seol. Yun Seol. Yun Seol. Double check.
Unseal.
Unseal. Okay. Interesting. Unseal. Unseal. Interesting. I would love to learn Latin and Greek. Okay, so it's Maghrib on my end in the next 2 minutes. So I'll wrap up this portion of this chapter. Okay. Thus, manuscripts fall into two rather well-defined groups. The earlier being written in uncial letters, figure 1, and the latter in minuscule, see figure 2. So, figure 1, this is Greek uncial script from Codex Sinaiticus. And the other one is Greek minuscule script from Lectionary 303, 12th or 13th century, actual width. So this is from the 4th, this is from the 12th or 13th. Clearly there's a massive difference. Massive difference between the two. I mean, extremely. It's like, for example, the difference between Uthmani script and Indo-Pak script or Turkic script. There's an obvious difference. But the beautiful thing is it doesn't change in terms of meaning and understanding. Here there's still disagreement in terms of the preservation. Right. The advantages of using minuscule script are obvious. Minuscule letters, as the name suggests, are smaller than unicals and thus writing is more compact. Hence, when the minuscule hand was used, less parchment was required and therefore the book was more economical. Furthermore, a literary work could be produced which was less bulky and therefore easier to handle than a larger manuscript. Moreover, it was possible to write minuscule letters more rapidly than unicals, and consequently books could be produced more quickly and more cheaply. It is easy to understand that this change in the style of script had a profound effect upon the textual tradition of the Greek Bible. Now the possession of copies of the scriptures and other literary works was placed within the reach of persons of limited means. When literary works were copied almost exclusively in the uncial script, such persons were obliged to get along without many books. Thus, minuscule hand was an important factor in the dissemination of culture in general, and of the scriptures in particular. The minuscule manuscripts of the New Testament outnumber the uncial manuscripts by more than 10 to 1, and although one must make allowance for the greater antiquity of the uncial style and consequently the greater likelihood of the destruction of uncial manuscripts through the ravages of time, very much of the disparity in the number of the survivors must be due to the increased ease with which the minuscule copies could be produced. In times of economic depression, when the cost of vellum increased, the parchment of an older manuscript would be used over again. The original writing was scrapped and washed off, the surface re-smoothed, and the new literary material written on the salvaged material. Such a book was called a palimpsest, which means re-scrapped. One of the half dozen or so important parchment manuscripts of the New Testament is such a one of the most important parchment manuscripts of the New Testament is such a palimpsest. Its name is Codex Ephraemi Scriptus. Written in the 5th century, it was erased in the 12th, and many of the sheets rewritten with the text of a Greek translation of 38 treatises or sermons by Saint Ephrem, Syrian church father of 4th century. By the application of certain chemical reagents and with the use of ultraviolet ray lamp, scholars have able to read much of the almost obliterated handwriting, although the task of deciphering it is most trying to the eyes. Wow, so they would use the vellum, right, parchment, and they would wash it off and rewrite it. So now the question is, how do you know the authenticity of what was rewritten or what was removed being valid? And according to this, Saint Ephrem, because one of the most important manuscripts of the New Testament is a pamphletist. Pamphletist is that which, as I mentioned, was washed and had to be rewritten. So there's many examples of this where children in Ethiopia, for example, they write the Quran on a piece of wood with some ink, and the reason they write it down, and I found this to be very, very useful, is to memorize and to understand and learn the Quran, and then after that they will remove it. Once they remove it, they will start again. But in this case, it's not memorized. So it's been rewritten on things that had nothing to do with the New Testament. It was just sermons and treatises. 38 of them by Saint Ephrem, whoever that was. Anyway, I think we are done for today.